Okay, I got a slightly longer lesson for you tonight. Don't worry, it's not going to be too much longer, just a couple of minutes extra. Welcome to topic 1.4a, your notes on the first empires. So, the goal here is to be able to identify and describe how early ancient empires expanded, ruled their people, and declined. Let's get started. One of the themes we're going to be exploring in this class throughout both semesters is the rise and fall of empires. So, in this lesson, we're going to be looking at four of the original empires to really develop in the world. We'll look at the Assyrian, Egyptian, Persian, and Qin dynasty over in China. For each of these empires, we're going to be looking at what their origins are, so where they came from, the role religion played in their cultures, how they went about ruling their empires, and what eventually led to their fall. Now, chronologically, these empires are pretty spread apart on our timeline, even if geographically, a lot of them are located right next to or even in some cases on top of each other. So you can see here on this timeline, this dotted line demarcates the difference between BCE, before Common Era, and CE, Common Era, in which we live in. You'll notice that the Egyptian Empire really is back here just after about 1600 BCE, and that lasts for quite a bit of time. The Assyrian Empire comes several centuries later, followed by the Persian Empire, and then over here is we're going to see the Qin dynasty over in China. You might be wondering what this is over here. This is really, we consider, the first major empire in the world, the Akkadian Empire created by Sargon the Great, which we're going to use as an example to help you understand what exactly an empire is. Alright, so that's that first key question in your notes you need to fill out. What is an empire? In this class, we're going to say that empires are defined by really three key features. The first is the ruler will control over many different peoples or regions. So a lot of these civilizations we've talked about already, they share a common culture, but an empire is when one culture conquers and controls another one. We'll see that empires also expand by conquering new lands and new nations by force, and they often use armies, roads, taxes, and religion to maintain control over these areas. Now, as mentioned a little bit earlier, an example of this is Sargon the Great's first Akkadian Empire. Now, Sargon is really the first ruler to unite multiple city-states under a single empire in Mesopotamia. Prior to this, we had individual cities that just controlled the farmlands around them, but they didn't really unite into a single coherent political empire. For reference, this is the map of the Eastern Hemisphere, and this red area is what we call Mesopotamia today. We're zooming in a little bit here. This green area is what we call the Fertile Crescent, where farming first develops way back in the Neolithic Age. Whereas Mesopotamia itself is right here, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Now, Sargon's empire didn't last very long, less than 100 years really, but it was important as it's the first step to uniting many peoples under a single government. At its peak, his empire stretched through all of Mesopotamia, you can see right here between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, up here into Anatolia, which is going to be playing a larger and more important role in coming lessons, over here to an area known as Elam at the time, today it's known as Iran, Syria over here, and even possibly a little bit into the Levant, Palestine, the area that we know as Israel and Palestine today. Now, once he conquered this large area, he had to control it and administer it. In order to do this, he created what was called a bureaucracy, essentially professional government workers who did the day-to-day tasks of actually running the government. He also built roads to unite the people in these different lands and promote trade between them. Okay, now we have a basic idea of what an empire is. Let's take a deep dive into the next empires that develop, the first of which will be the Egyptian Empire. You'll notice here that there is several centuries in between when Sargon the Great's Akkadian Empire collapses over in Mesopotamia in the Middle East and the rise of the Egyptian Empire in what we call the New Kingdom in Northeast Africa that will then expand into his former territories. Now, the Egyptian civilization dates back to around 3100 BCE. That's over 5,000 years ago. And because it's such an old civilization, it goes through multiple periods of rising and falling. Now, for much of its early time, the first couple thousand years, they thought the deserts that surrounded them would keep them safe. However, they were sorely mistaken when in the mid-17th century BC, a group known as the Hyksos invaded from Western Asia, that's the Middle East region, and introduced a new type of technology that helped them overwhelm the Egyptians for a short time, the chariot right here. A quick note, it's hard for us to really grasp how old Egypt is, because at the time the Hyksos had invaded Egypt, the pyramids were already 1,000 years old. That's right, by the time the Hyksos had invaded, Egypt was already an ancient civilization and had built their pyramids, the quintessential idea that we all think of when we think of Egypt, 1,000 years before the Hyksos even arrived. And it'll be another 3,000 years after the Hyksos are defeated before the United States of America is founded as a country. So Egypt is really old. So these Hyksos, who came from this region over here in Western Asia, they only really ruled over Egypt for about 100 years before the Egyptians rallied together and kicked them out, establishing the New Kingdom, which will last for about 500 years. It's this new kingdom that we're focusing on right here, not the middle or old kingdoms that came before it. This is because this is the period where Egypt really starts to expand out east and south, conquering new areas, and we can really start considering them an empire. So by the 1400s BCE, they've conquered areas in the south, known as Nubia and Kush. They've expanded up here into the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea, conquering what we know as Palestine and Syria. So they've really kind of expanded out this time, and the chariot weapons are key to this. Now, religiously speaking, you're probably aware of this already. The pharaohs were the kings of Egypt, and they were believed to be gods in human form. That's right. So they ruled. The reason they said they had the right to rule over the people of Egypt is because, well, they were a god, and gods can't be questioned. So there's a deep tie between religion and government in everyday life. In fact, the temples weren't just places for religious services, they're also centers administering or carrying out the laws created by the pharaohs. So again, you see this deep connection between religion and government. It's one of these themes we're going to see over and over and over again. That's going to cause a lot of problems for civilizations throughout this course. It's also around this time you see the Nubians from the south that they had conquered starting to worship Egyptian gods and build temples similar to the Egyptians, including their own pyramids. Now, during this 500-year period, a lot is going on, but generally religious authority, taxation, and bureaucracies are the three ways that they control their empire, right? The pharaohs have this status as living gods, which gives legitimacy to their power. I'm in charge because I am a god, right? Can't get much more powerful than that. Now, the taxes would be paid to these god kings in the form of two things. A percent of your harvest, so as a farmer, you'd be growing most of your food to survive, but you give a portion of that to the king as a form of tax. But during non-growing and harvest seasons, you'd also have to spend so many hours providing labor to the pharaohs to build monuments and other things. So, no, the monuments of Egypt were not built by slave labor, although slavery did exist. Most of them were primarily built using labor that was being paid in the form of taxes. Now, the bureaucracies were filled with professional government workers who oversaw all of the empire to make sure that things were running the way they were supposed to be, right? So these are guys who got their jobs because they know what they're doing. A good bureaucracy is essential for a thriving government. Again, back to those southern Nubians that they had conquered, they are adopting Egyptian writing styles as well as their religion and burial customs. What we start to see in a lot of these empires is the dominant culture seems to start seeping into the conquered cultures. We'll talk more about the collapse of the New Kingdom when we get to the Bronze Age collapse in a few lessons, but the short version here is that there are a lot of natural disasters going on, international trade routes are collapsing, and this mysterious group known as the Sea People start arriving and attacking by sea, causing havoc all across the region, including in the New Kingdom. Egypt doesn't fully collapse, they actually fend off these attacks, and they limp along for a while, but are eventually conquered by those southern Nubians who take over the New Kingdom and kind of become the new pharaohs. However, they're eventually overthrown by the Egyptians temporarily before they're taken over by the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans, then the Ottomans. Egypt will never again be a strong, independent empire. All right, let's move on to the next group, the Assyrians. Now, there is some overlap between the Egyptians and the Assyrians, but you'll notice there's kind of a gap here of a couple centuries. This is because this era is known as the proper Assyrian Empire, but Assyria was doing things before this period, and Egypt was doing things after this period. So here's kind of some overlap, and these two will have some contact, and will have been fighting each other over that area, specifically in the area we know as Palestine today. So the Assyrians are in this region here that was once part of Sargon the Great's empire, right? Once Sargon's empire collapses around 2154 BCE, people kind of go their own ways. There are other smaller empires rising and falling. But really, it's during this period, a city-state known as Assur will start conquering its neighbors, establishing the Assyrian Empire. First based out of the city of Assur, which we don't really know where it is, somewhere we think it was around here, but eventually they'll build a new capital over here in Nineveh. So by 650 BCE, the Assyrians have conquered all of Mesopotamia. They moved here into Syria. They've got this area known as Palestine, where Jerusalem, modern-day Israel is. Egypt is falling partly under their control. Some parts of Anatolia are under their control. And they're able to do this because of the use of siege warfare and iron weapons. So they used iron daggers and swords, as well as iron-tipped spears, giving them an advantage, and large shields for protection. They used a lot of archery. They used ladders to get over the walls of defending cities. They'd even dig tunnels under the walls of the enemy cities in order to get the walls to collapse. Now, the Assyrians were known as savage to their opponents. If you weren't killed in the initial conquest, you'd either be beheaded or impaled if you were a man, while women and children were sometimes murdered, but also sold into slavery. Now, this is common practices across cultures at this time. However, while a lot of these practices were common across cultures throughout history, the Syrians, according to historical record, were a bit extra, if you know what I mean. Now, religion didn't play as a big of a role in the empire as it say did in the Egyptian Empire and the New Kingdom, but the kings still claimed that they had divine support from their god Ashur, which sounds like Assur, their capital city, right? You see how the two are correlated, named after each other, and so the kings claimed they should be in charge because, well, their god put them in charge. Each of their cities would have temples that honored the gods, and these gods were a lot of time connected to war and conquest. Essentially, their gods demanded they go out and conquer new areas, which forced them to push out further and further, conquering more and more lands. Well in control of these territories, they built a vast network of roads to promote trade and communication across their empire. They also established a massive library in their new capital city of Nineveh. This had thousands of clay tablets because the Assyrians, like a lot of cultures throughout history, realized the more knowledge you have, the more powerful you are. But in order to keep control of this larger and larger territory, they had to rule through the military, through fear, by forcing these areas to pay tribute, and even forcing relocations of entire populations by essentially deporting them, kicking them out of their homelands, and sending them to live somewhere else. In fact, the Assyrians were the first to kick the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, out of their homeland in what we know now today as Palestine or Israel, and force them to move to a different part of the empire so they would be easier to control them, hoping that this would sever them from their gods. But this will play an important role in the development of Judaism. We'll get to that in a coming lesson. Now remember, warfare and conquest and expanding their borders was part of their religious practices, and this forced them to expand too far to make their empire too big to control, and they essentially stretched themselves too thin. They also, remember, were ruling their subjects very, very harshly, using the military to keep them under control, upsetting a lot of people. So much so that by the year 612 BCE, a bunch of different peoples, nations gathered together, and they burned down and destroyed the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, and the empire soon collapses after that. Moving on to our next empire chronologically, let's introduce, but not be done with, the Persians, who we're going to be talking about in the next unit as well. You'll notice chronologically, the Persian Empire and the Assyrian Empire are pretty close to each other on a timeline, separated only by, a few years. But again, the Syrians kind of limp along, so there's some overlap here. It's not an immediate collapse. So the Persian Empire has its origins in around the year 550 BCE under the rule of Cyrus the Great, who unites the Iranian people in this region. Soon after Cyrus's people storm out of the mountains here and conquer Iran, they push out west into Mesopotamia and even as far west as Anatolia, which is going to bring them a conflict with the Greeks, but that's for next unit. Now, Cyrus does conquer Babylon over here in Mesopotamia, and he actually frees the Jewish people, allowing them to go back to their homeland in Israel-Palestine after they've been exiled by the conquest of the Assyrians. The next emperors pushed their boundaries into Egypt even further, as well even into the Indus Valley by 518 BCE. Their military is the key to their success, obviously. So they draft commoners to pay their taxes in the form of military service, but they also have elite professional warriors, a group of which are known as the Immortals, that are seen as pretty much unstoppable. Combining these drafted soldiers and their professional soldiers, the Immortals, as well as other professional soldiers, they combine this with a cavalry, so soldiers on horseback that make them pretty much unstoppable across this region. Their style of combat is what allowed them to be so successful. So traditionally, armies would have the two armies pushing up against each other like this, and whoever had the bigger army or who was, braver, they would be the one better weapons. They'd be the ones who would be successful in combat. The Persians combined their foot soldiers, the infantry, with their cavalry. So while their foot soldiers, the infantry, would be fighting the other infantry, the Persians would have their cavalry flank on either side, crashing into both sides in order to destroy the enemy lines, and this was kind of their super weapon. Religiously, they practiced a faith known as Zoroastrianism. This was a belief in a struggle between good and evil. So it wasn't monotheistic with one god or polytheistic with many gods. There really was two gods. One god of good, light, and creation, and one god of evil, darkness, and destruction. They believed that all of humanity was caught up in this battle between good and evil, and taught that our thoughts and our actions both played a role in the struggle between good and evil. The more good things you did and the more good thoughts you had, the stronger the god of goodness became. The more evil acts you did, and the more evil thoughts you had, the stronger the evil god of destruction would become. Many of these Zoroastrian beliefs will find their way into both the Jewish and Christian faiths. In fact, Zoroastrian was very tolerant of religions within their empire, and you were free to practice whatever religion you wanted, as long as it wasn't deemed to be aligned with the god of evil and darkness. Now, the Persians kind of take a different route here. Just like the Assyrians, they built roads in order to connect their empire. Their main road here being the royal road here that stretches across Mesopotamia into Anatolia, allowing these places to be connected. And that's great for trade and for running the government. But they also created standardized coins, taxes, laws, and weights. And this all made trade a lot easier because everyone was using the same money. They knew what you had to do when you're entering a contract, and they knew like if you were looking for a certain amount of food, it was all measured the exact same way, no matter where you were in the empire. Beyond religious tolerance, they also banned slavery, which was kind of a big thing. In order to control this massive empire, the Persian emperors divided their empire into what they called 20 satraps. You can think of these like how the United States is divided into 50 states. Each of these satraps would have a local governor and a royal inspector to keep control locally. And in fact, they encouraged everyone in this large empire to be loyal to the emperor by respecting local customs and religions. So whereas other empires, other cultures would come and take over areas and force you to start worshiping their gods or speaking their language or whatever it was, the Persians, when they entered an area, they were like, yeah, you have to pledge your loyalty, pay your taxes, but otherwise you can kind of live the way you've always been living. And this kept people happy so they wouldn't revolt. Now, we'll get to the downfall of the Persians in the next unit. The short version, eventually a guy named Alexander the Great brings his armies in 330 BCE and crushes the Persians, but we'll get to that. Alright, to end the speed run through the first empires, let's return to China and see what happened after the period of warring states. So while the Qin dynasty, the Chinese empire, is geographically separated from the areas we've been talking about, chronologically, they're not too far away from the end of the Persian empire. Though again, there would have been no contact between these because they're just so far apart. So here you can see a map of the Qin dynasty at its greatest extent. You notice this red line is the first reaches of the previous Zhou dynasty, so they've actually gone beyond where the Zhou had lived. You remember where we last left off China. The Zhou dynasty had collapsed as the local nobles were constantly fighting each other, vying for more power and influence. This ends in 221 BCE when a guy named Shi Hongdi becomes the emperor of China by rolling through all these territories and putting them all under his control. Essentially, he wins the war between all the nobles. In order to do this, he takes advantage of cast iron technology to create mass-produced weapons with interchangeable parts for weapons like the crossbow. Gives him a real advantage. You can see this massive crossbow, the way it works here. This thing could launch a bolt that was built with cast iron quite a distance through armor, and it made the Shi Hongdi's armies pretty much unstoppable. So religion didn't play as big of a role in the Qin dynasty as it did in the other empires we were just looking at. However, the mandate of heaven that we talked about in a previous lesson still plays an important role. Ancestor worship is also still a key part of life in China at this time. Instead of using religion to justify power and control, the Qin dynasty used a philosophy known as legalism. So the legalist philosophy said that people are naturally selfish and bad, and they need to be controlled by strict laws, otherwise chaos will run supreme. The way you stop chaos is you give all the power to an emperor to do whatever they want to keep people under control, and you would do this through a system of harsh punishments and very clear rewards. The legalist philosophy left no room for dispute, no room for criticizing the government. So there's no free speech. In fact, even books that criticized legalism were burned, and scholars would either be executed or forced to be silenced so they wouldn't speak out against the emperor. It wasn't enough for the emperors to control what people were doing, they had to control people's thoughts as well. It's during this period we see a large chunks that we now know as the Great Wall of China being built in order to keep the invaders from the north out. But this harsh rule and censorship would eventually lead to rebellions after the death of Emperor Shi Hongdi and the collapse of the Shi dynasty, which was very short-lived. That dynastic cycle, though, will keep turning as a new dynasty, a new family will take over it, claiming the mandate of heaven, and they'll be known as the Han dynasty, which we'll come back to eventually. Alright, let's wrap this up. What are some common themes that are running across these empires? All these empires expanded through military conquest and the use of new technologies. Egypt used chariots and composite bows. Assyria used siege weapons and iron weapons. The Persians used combinations of cavalry and foot soldiers. And the Qin dynasty used mass production techniques combined with crossbows and cast iron. All of these gave them an advantage over their enemies so they could build their empires. Once they conquered a new area, they all used infrastructure, laws, religion, or ideology in order to keep people under control. Right? The Egyptians used the idea that the pharaohs are gods. The Chinese emperors used the idea of mandate of heaven, that the gods put them in charge, and so that's why they could use legalism. The Persians, Chinese, and Assyrians all built roads to connect these empires, promote trade, and move their armies, and military power was the key to all their success. And they all declined for very similar reasons, right? Rebellions, invasions, internal conflicts. The Assyrians and the Qin dynasty relied on harsh laws, which made their people rise up against them. The Egyptians and Persians felt outside invaders, and all suffered to some extent because the rulers just weren't up to the job of ruling. Just because you had one great ruler at the beginning of an empire doesn't mean their children or grandchildren will continue to be good rulers. This is kind of a problem of inheriting power. Another theme we're going to be revisiting throughout this class. All right, pause the video and finish out here by rewriting today's goal, identifying those 3 important facts from the notes that help meet that goal, and one question you still have to show me you're that intellectual curiosity, because there's a lot going on here. You gotta have at least one question. All right, until I see you in class again, sorry about how long this was.